The sun was shining brightly, casting a golden hue over the sprawling estate where Emma and Mark had planned to begin the rest of their lives together. The air was filled with the scent of roses, and the soft murmur of guests gathered around, eagerly awaiting the ceremony to start. Emma, in her delicate white gown, stood in front of the mirror, her heart fluttering with nervous anticipation. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. But something felt off. As the minutes ticked by, her joy turned to worry. Mark was late. The ceremony was scheduled to start an hour ago, and yet there was no sign of him. At first, the wedding planner reassured her, saying it was probably just a delay, perhaps something trivial, like a traffic jam or a forgotten detail. But Emma knew better. She felt a growing pit of dread in her stomach, a sense that something much worse was unfolding. Her father, sensing her anxiety, approached and took her hands in his. "He'll be here," he said softly, though his voice betrayed his own doubts. Emma nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that Mark wasn't just running late, he wasn't coming. The guests shifted awkwardly in their seats, their whispers growing louder as the time dragged on. Emma's bridesmaids exchanged nervous glances, trying to hide their concern. The once joyful air had turned heavy with uncertainty. Finally, one of Mark's groomsmen entered the room, his face pale, his eyes downcast. Emma's heart dropped. "Emma, I'm so sorry," he began, his voice trembling. "We can't find him. He's gone." The words echoed in her mind, cold and final. Gone. How could he be gone? Mark had vanished without a trace, and with those few words, Emma's perfect day crumbled into a nightmare. No explanations, no goodbye, just an empty space where her fiancé should have been. Emma stood frozen, her mind unable to process what she was hearing. Her family surrounded her, offering their support, but it felt distant, like a blur of voices and faces. She had been ready to start a new chapter of her life with the man she loved, and now she was left standing at the altar alone, heartbroken and confused. The days after the wedding were a haze of disbelief and unanswered questions. Emma couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. She sat by the phone, waiting for a call, a message, anything from Mark that would explain his sudden disappearance. But none came. Her family and friends did their best to console her, but no one could understand the depth of her pain. How could they? She had been left without closure, without an explanation, and it was tearing her apart. Everywhere she went, people whispered. In the small town they lived in, news of the runaway groom spread quickly. Emma couldn't escape the pitying glances and the hushed gossip. It wasn't long before rumors started to circulate. Maybe Mark had cold feet, maybe he'd found someone else, maybe he was hiding some dark secret. Each rumor was like a knife in Emma's heart, twisting deeper every time she heard it. She tried to move on, to distract herself with work and friends, but the weight of Mark's absence loomed over her every moment. Nights were the hardest. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of their relationship in her mind, searching for signs she had missed. But there were none. He had loved her, or at least, she thought he had. What had gone so terribly wrong? 5 long years had passed since that fateful day, and while time had dulled the sharp edges of her grief, the scars were still there. Emma had done her best to rebuild her life. She threw herself into her work as a lawyer, dedicating countless hours to her clients, earning the respect of her peers. Her friends encouraged her to start dating again, but Emma had no interest in romance. She had given her heart to Mark once, and it had nearly destroyed her. Life had become routine, predictable, and safe, exactly what Emma needed. She had traded the small town where she and Mark had planned their future for the bustling city. Here, no one knew her story, and she could pretend, at least on the surface, that the past didn't haunt her. But deep down, Emma still carried the weight of Mark's disappearance, the unanswered questions gnawing at her every time she let her guard down. Her friends had long stopped mentioning Mark's name. They believed she had moved on, but Emma hadn't. Not really. How could she when she never got the closure she needed? Part of her still clung to the hope that one day, she would find out what had happened to him. She told herself it was foolish, but she couldn't help it. She needed answers. She needed to know why the man she loved had walked out of her life without a word. On an ordinary, rainy afternoon, Emma found herself seeking refuge in a quiet cafe she frequented. She sat by the window, sipping her coffee and watching the raindrops race down the glass. The city streets bustled with people rushing to escape the downpour, but inside, it was warm and peaceful. She had brought some work with her, but her mind wandered, as it often did on days like this. As she glanced around the cafe, her gaze landed on a man sitting alone at a table near the back. He was reading a book, his face partially obscured by the soft glow of the overhead lights. Something about him seemed familiar, tugging at a memory she couldn't quite place. Emma's heart began to race. Could it be? She squinted, trying to see him more clearly. Her pulse quickened as realization washed over her. It was Mark. He was alive. He was sitting right there, as if the last 5 years had never happened. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't imagining it. She knew that face, those eyes. But how could this be? She stood abruptly, her legs trembling beneath her. She wanted to run to him, to demand answers, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. What was she supposed to say? What could he possibly say to make this right? Gathering her courage, Emma approached the table slowly, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "Mark," she whispered, barely able to get the word out. The man looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, she saw a flicker of recognition in his gaze, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. His brow furrowed in confusion, and he shook his head slightly. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" Emma's blood ran cold. His voice was the same, his mannerisms identical, yet the words felt like a punch to the gut. "It's me, Emma," she said, her voice trembling. "We were going to get married. 5 years ago, you disappeared." The man, Mark, shook his head again, more firmly this time. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. My name is David. I don't know you." For a moment, Emma couldn't breathe. She stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to tell her this was some cruel joke. But his face remained serious. He didn't remember her. How could that be? She had spent 5 years wondering what happened, and now here he was, sitting in a cafe, claiming to be someone else. Emma felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Nothing made sense anymore. David, as he called himself, seemed genuinely perplexed by Emma's distress. He invited her to sit, explaining that he had no memory of anything she was talking about. His life, according to him, began 5 years ago. He worked as a doctor, had no family that he remembered, and certainly had no past with a woman named Emma. The more he spoke, the more Emma's heart broke. She watched him closely as he spoke. There was no malice in his eyes, no hint of a lie. He truly believed he was someone else. But how could that be? Emma's mind raced with possibilities. Could he have lost his memory? Could he be in hiding? Was this all some elaborate scheme? She couldn't be sure, but what she did know was that this man, no matter what he claimed, was her Mark. Despite his insistence that he didn't know her, Emma couldn't let go. She returned to the cafe every day, hoping to see him again, hoping that maybe something would jog his memory. But each time she saw him, it was the same story. He was David, not Mark. Still, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something, some crucial piece of the puzzle that would explain everything. Determined to uncover the truth, Emma began investigating Mark's disappearance again. She visited the police station where she had reported him missing all those years ago, hoping to find some new clue. But the case was cold, the trail long since gone cold. Frustrated but not deterred, Emma hired a private investigator to look into David's past, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain how Mark had become this stranger. As the days passed, Emma grew more and more convinced that David was indeed Mark. The way he smiled, the way he ran his fingers through his hair when he was deep in thought, the way he stirred his coffee, it was all too familiar. But without proof, without a confession, what could she do? The investigators' findings only deepened the mystery. There were no records of David before 5 years ago. It was as if he had appeared out of thin air. Emma's mind raced with possibilities. Had Mark suffered some kind of accident that wiped his memory? Had he been living under a new identity, hiding from something or someone? The more she thought about it, the more questions she had. And with every unanswered question, her frustration grew. She needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. One evening, Emma approached David at the cafe again, this time determined to get answers. She sat across from him, her hands trembling as she pulled out something she hadn't shown him before, a small, silver ring. It was the ring Mark had given her when he proposed. She placed it on the table between them, watching his face closely for any sign of recognition. David's eyes fell on the ring, and for a moment, his hand froze. He stared at it, his brow furrowing in confusion. "That's mine," he whispered, almost to himself. Emma's heart leaped. This was it, the breakthrough she had been waiting for. "Yes," she said softly, leaning forward. "You gave it to me 5 years ago. Don't you remember?" David looked up at her, his eyes clouded with uncertainty. He shook his head slowly, but there was something different in his expression now. He didn't outright deny it, like he had before. There was a flicker of doubt, a small crack in the wall he had built around his new identity. For the first time, Emma felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could remember. As the days passed, David became more withdrawn, as if the sight of the ring had triggered something deep inside him. He started asking Emma questions about their past, about the life they had planned together. He seemed curious, yet distant, as though part of him wanted to believe her but another part was too afraid to. Emma told him everything, their first date, the proposal, the wedding that never happened. Slowly, bits and pieces of Mark's memory began to surface. He recalled small, insignificant details at first, a cafe they used to frequent, a song they had danced to. But the bigger moments remained elusive, trapped somewhere in the fog of his mind. Emma was patient, knowing that this was the first step toward finding the man she had lost. But even as the memories trickled back, there was still something off. Something didn't add up. The private investigator called Emma one evening with news that left her reeling. David's past was more complicated than either of them had imagined. He hadn't just lost his memory, he had been in an accident, one that involved more than just physical trauma. There were records indicating that someone had tampered with his medical records, erasing large portions of his history. Emma's heart sank. Who would do such a thing, and why? As Emma pressed for more answers, she discovered that Mark, or David, had been diagnosed with a rare neurological disorder just before their wedding day. The condition had caused temporary amnesia, but the effects had lingered, preventing him from fully recovering his past. His family, fearing that the truth would only worsen his condition, had decided to keep Emma in the dark, believing it was better for him to start over. When Emma confronted Mark's family, they confirmed the story, apologizing for the pain they had caused her. They explained that they had been trying to protect Mark, thinking it would be too traumatic for him to return to a life he couldn't remember. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Why had no one reached out to her? Why had they let her suffer all these years, believing Mark had abandoned her? Mark's parents admitted that they had struggled with the decision. They had been advised by doctors to keep him away from anything that might trigger a breakdown. But Emma wasn't convinced. She felt there was something darker at play, something they weren't telling her. Determined to uncover the full truth, she continued her investigation, knowing that the real answer was still out there, waiting to be found. Emma finally confronted Mark's family face to face, determined to hear their side of the story. They seemed genuinely remorseful, but their apologies felt hollow. Mark's brother, Alex, was especially defensive, insisting that they had done what was best for everyone. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Alex was hiding something. His eyes darted nervously every time she pressed him for details about the day Mark disappeared. As Emma dug deeper, she uncovered a shocking truth. Mark hadn't just disappeared, he had been manipulated, his memory loss orchestrated by someone close to him. Alex had been the one to convince the family to keep Mark isolated, claiming it was for his own good. But Emma's instincts told her otherwise. Why would Alex go to such lengths to keep them apart? What did he have to gain? The more Emma uncovered, the more certain she became that Alex had played a role in Mark's disappearance. It was no accident that Mark had lost his memory on their wedding day. Alex had been jealous of his brother for years, harboring feelings for Emma that he had kept hidden. When the opportunity presented itself, Alex had seized it, ensuring that Mark would never return to the life he had built with her. The truth hit Emma like a freight train. Alex had orchestrated the entire thing out of jealousy. He had drugged Mark on the night before the wedding, causing the neurological damage that wiped his memory. When Mark failed to show up at the wedding, Alex had pretended to be devastated, all while hiding the fact that he was responsible for his brother's disappearance. Emma was furious, but more than that, she was heartbroken. How could someone be so cruel, so selfish? She confronted Alex, demanding to know why he had done it. He didn't deny it. In fact, he seemed almost proud of his actions. "I loved you," he said simply. "I couldn't stand the thought of Mark having the life I wanted." The revelation left Emma reeling. Alex had stolen 5 years of her life, 5 years of happiness she could have had with Mark. But more than that, he had destroyed his own brother's life, all because of a twisted sense of entitlement. Emma knew she had to tell Mark the truth, but she feared what it would do to him. Would he be able to handle the betrayal? When Emma told Mark the truth about Alex's betrayal, he was devastated. The man he had trusted more than anyone had taken everything from him, his memories, his future, and the love of his life. Mark struggled to process the weight of it all. He felt like a stranger in his own skin, unsure of who he was or what his life had become. The memories he had regained were tainted now, overshadowed by the knowledge of Alex's treachery. But even in the face of this revelation, Emma stood by him. She had spent years searching for him, and now that they were together again, she wasn't about to let go. Slowly, they began the process of healing, trying to rebuild the life they had once dreamed of. It wasn't easy. Mark's trust in his family was shattered, and the memories of their shared past were still hazy. But with Emma's support, he found the strength to move forward. Alex, meanwhile, was forced to face the consequences of his actions. Mark cut all ties with him, unable to forgive the betrayal. Their family was torn apart by the revelation, and Alex found himself alone, the very thing he had feared the most. Emma felt no sympathy for him. He had taken everything from her, and now he was paying the price. As Mark and Emma navigated their new reality, they found themselves growing closer than ever before. Their shared pain, their struggle to rebuild, had forged a bond stronger than anything they had experienced before. It wasn't the life they had planned, but it was a life they were building together, one day at a time. Mark's memories continued to return, though some things remained lost forever. He would never fully remember the man he had been before the wedding, but in many ways, that was a blessing. The Mark he was now, David, as he had been for the last 5 years, was a new man, shaped by his experiences and the love he had found again with Emma. Emma, too, had changed. She was stronger, more resilient, and more certain of what she wanted in life. She had spent so long searching for answers, but now, she was ready to stop looking back and start moving forward. Together, they made a promise to leave the past behind and focus on the future they would build together. One quiet evening, as they sat on the porch of their new home, Mark took Emma's hand. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the horizon, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers. It was a peaceful moment, one that felt almost surreal after everything they had been through. "Emma," Mark said softly, his voice full of emotion, "I know I've asked you this before, but it feels like a lifetime ago." Emma looked at him, her heart swelling with love. She knew what was coming, and yet, the words still took her breath away. "Will you marry me?" Mark asked, his eyes shining with hope. Emma smiled, tears welling in her eyes. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. 1,000 times, yes. As Mark slipped the ring back onto her finger, it felt like they were closing a chapter on the pain of the past and opening a new one, full of hope and promise. This time, there would be no running, no disappearing. They had found their way back to each other, and nothing would ever tear them apart again. Mark and Emma's life together wasn't perfect. They still had moments of doubt, of fear, of wondering what might have been if things had gone differently. But those moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the love they had for each other. They had faced more than most couples could ever imagine, and yet, here they were, together, stronger than ever. They built a life filled with small joys and quiet moments. Sunday mornings spent sipping coffee on the porch, late-night walks under the stars, and shared laughter over dinner. Their love was steady and unwavering, the kind that only comes from weathering the storms of life together. For the first time in years, Emma felt at peace. She no longer looked for answers in the past, no longer questioned what had happened or why. She had found what she had been searching for all along, love, not just with Mark, but with herself. She had learned to let go of the pain and embrace the happiness that life had to offer. And for that, she was grateful. As the years passed, Emma and Mark's life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Mark returned to his work as a doctor, finding fulfillment in helping others, while Emma continued to build her career as a lawyer. They supported each other through the ups and downs, always knowing that, no matter what, they had each other to lean on. They talked often about the life they had once dreamed of, the wedding that never happened, the years they had lost. But rather than dwelling on the what-ifs, they chose to focus on the here and now. They had been given a second chance, and they weren't going to waste it. Every day was a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had to be thankful for. Together, they traveled, explored new places, and created new memories. They made it a point to live each day to the fullest, never taking a single moment for granted. Their love story wasn't the one they had planned, but it was theirs, and that made it all the more special. Mark and Emma's journey wasn't without its challenges, but they faced them head-on, always with the knowledge that they had each other. As they looked toward the future, they talked about starting a family, building a home, and continuing to create the life they had once dreamed of. They knew there would be more obstacles to overcome, more hardships to face. But they also knew that, together, they could handle anything. Their love had been tested in the most unimaginable ways, and yet, it had survived. And that, Emma thought, was the most beautiful thing of all. As they stood hand in hand, watching the sunset from the porch of their home, they smiled at each other, knowing that the future was bright with possibility. This was the life they had fought for, the life they had earned. And they were ready for whatever came next. On the anniversary of their first proposal, Mark surprised Emma with a quiet celebration, just the two of them. He led her to the place where he had first asked her to marry him, the memory of that day still fresh in their minds. But this time, there was no sadness, no fear of the unknown. Only love, pure and simple. "Emma," Mark said softly, taking her hands in his, "I may never remember everything, but one thing I know for certain is that I've always loved you. From the moment we met, through all the ups and downs, that has never changed." Emma smiled, tears brimming in her eyes as she listened to his heartfelt words. "I know," she whispered. "And I've never stopped loving you either." They stood there for a moment, wrapped in each other's embrace, the weight of the past finally lifted. They had made it through the storm, and now they stood together, stronger than ever. And as they looked toward the future, they knew that their love would carry them through whatever life had in store. As the years went by, Emma and Mark continued to build their life together, creating new memories and strengthening the bond that had brought them back together. Their love story wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was all that mattered. They had faced unimaginable challenges, but through it all, they had remained by each other's side, unwavering in their love and commitment. And in the end, that was what truly mattered. Not the wedding that never happened, or the years they had lost, but the life they had built together, filled with love, joy, and the promise of a future bright with possibility. They had found their way back to each other, and they knew that, no matter what came next, they would always have each other. Their happily ever after wasn't just a dream, it was their reality. And for that, Emma and Mark were forever grateful.